Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So this week we're going to be talking about the Sega Game Gear. So this was Sega's first and only handheld console that they made, and I have a lot of fondness for this system. I never had one as a kid, but I did have friends who did own this, and my cousin did, so I did play on the Game Gear a decent amount in the 90s. So if you have one of these now and it's fully working, then you know that the original screen is actually pretty unpleasant to use. So, I mean, on the positive side, it's backlit, but it's really power hungry. It's very susceptible to having dead lines or dead pixels. And, it just really doesn't look all that great. And thankfully, nowadays we can do a lot better. So there are a number of different screen replacement mods for the Game Gear. There's the McWill, which we have right here. And more recently, there are ones that are produced by Retro6 and by Benven. But the McWill mod was the original one. And so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be installing this McWill screen replacement. So you have your circuit board here on this side, and then you have the screen here on the opposite side. And personally, I'm a big fan of this one. It's what I have installed in my personal system. And it's really evolved over the years, and it looks fantastic. So yeah, let's go ahead, get this thing installed, and see how it looks. Okay, so I've got the system running, and I've already repaired this console by replacing all of the electrolytic capacitors. That's a really important thing to do. All Game Gears have defective capacitors. They leak, they cause damage, they smell horrible. They're just generally a pain to deal with. So if you own a Game Gear, before you even consider doing this mod, or any of the other screen mods, you've got to replace the capacitors. So yeah, I've done that already, and so what I wanted to do now was just give you guys a brief demonstration of how the screen looks. And I mean, as you can see, it's definitely backlit, but it is pretty, I don't know, unpleasant to deal with. You do have options with contrast right here. But you don't have much in the way of a good in terms of good illumination and viewing, and the viewing angles are pretty bad. Like right now this looks decent on camera, but for me it looks absolutely terrible. um, so yeah, that gives you an idea of just what kind of limitations you're talking about. And of course I have this thing plugged into the wall because again, if I was using my 6 AA batteries, they'd just be, going out pretty quickly. So yeah, let's go ahead, take this thing apart and see what it looks like inside and get started with the mod. All right, so taking the console apart is pretty straightforward. You've got 6 Phillips screws that are located all around the back of the console. There's also a security bit screw. It's a game bit screw right here. And so you just need one of these game bit screwdrivers to get that one out and open it up. And then when you're at this point, it's also a good time to just inspect the battery compartments and see how everything looks. A lot of times people forget batteries in these things, and they end up ruining the terminals. You can see here, this one is not so great. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some white vinegar and apply it here. White vinegar is acidic, and this stuff is basic. It's called battery acid, but it's actually a base. It's not an acid. So I'm going to use the white vinegar to neutralize the battery acid and get this terminal working again. All right, so once you do that, it opens up kind of like a clamshell like this. And so you can see that the Game Gear is composed of 3 PCBs. You've got this main PCB over here, and then you've got these 2 daughter board PCBs. This one regulates power. This one is specific for sound. And so yeah, you guys can see I've already replaced all of the electrolytics on here, and this one is working perfectly. So what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna take the console out, and it's just a bunch of Phillips screws to get this thing disconnected. And you also need to do a few minor modifications to the shell as well. So you can see this little piece of metal here. This is for RF shielding, and it also just protects the cartridge as it goes in so that it doesn't go anywhere other than inside of the slot. I did make some modifications to it already. I used a set of flush cutters. I clipped all of this metal right here because there are these pieces that kind of stick out. There's also a piece that goes out over here, over the soundboard. I got rid of it as well, just because it just makes it easier and cleaner to work with. It's not necessary, but I felt like doing it anyway. All right, so let me go ahead and disconnect these 3 cables here. And let's take this thing apart and go from there. All right, so I've got the motherboard outside of the shell, and the only other mod that we need to make to the case itself is right here. This post is unnecessary. It actually hits the McWill PCB if you leave it in, so we're going to take that out. But otherwise, that's it for the case mods. Everything else is just going to stay exactly the way that it is. Okay. So now we've got the PCB in place here, and we're going to start by removing a bunch of surface mount components that are located throughout the board. We also have some larger components like this cap here, this little coil. These parts are going to come out as well. So what I'm going to do is get started with that, and then I'll just show you guys what I removed after I take care of it. Okay, so I ended up removing a fair number of surface mount components and a few through-hole components, and most of them have to do with the high voltage stuff that was needed to power the old screen. So let me just show you what I did. So I removed some surface mount components right here, a transistor right here, and another resistor right here. I would say this might be the toughest components to remove because you're very close to the volume wheel and or sorry, the contrast wheel, and you can melt this thing if you bring the iron too close. So you got to kind of be careful and stay away. You just pass heat on both sides and then the parts just kind of fall off. The other part that makes this difficult is that you've got to keep this capacitor right over here, and it's surrounded by a whole bunch of stuff that needs to come out. Sometimes I just say whatever and I remove it anyway and then clean the area and reattach it afterwards. But, you know, it's risky. You don't want to lose this part. So just be careful with this section. Otherwise, it's not too bad. You've got two resistors right over here and a transistor called Q2 right here. You've got this coil, this large capacitor, and another cap right over here that you've got to take out. There's a fuse that goes. There's a resistor called R38 here that needs to go. There's one called R41 that needs to go, and then 44, and let's see, where's 43? Did I leave 43 behind? No, I did not. Here's 43. 43 is gone as well. And then on the opposite side of the board, there are actually two transistors that need to go as well. So it's Q3 and Q4. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but there's these little white dots over here. That's actually glue. So these were glued down and then soldered into place. So sometimes you need a little extra heat to get these guys off. But yeah, that's basically all that there is to it in order to get all these components removed. So it's really not too bad. All right, so now what we've got to do is we've got to actually remove the screen itself. So the first thing I've got to do here is take this piece of tape out. So this tape just holds it in place. So you can just peel it off. And you might be tempted to just, you know, violently yank the screen out, but that is a bad idea because we're going to be soldering onto these pads over here later on. So what I like to do is just add a bit of flux to the ribbon cable, like so. And, you know, these are soldered into place, but I also believe there's some glue involved as well. So you just kind of heat up the pads, and they just kind of disconnect. And you can hear them snapping free. And if you do this slowly and carefully, you'll get them all disconnected, and then you just want to make sure that all these pads are actually not bridged together, that they're all separated. All right, so I've got the Game Gear partially reassembled again. So all I did basically was just reattach it to all of the wires, and then I've got the power supply plugged in. And the reason why I'm doing this is just to make sure that the Game Gear is still working properly. I just removed a whole bunch of components, so this is kind of a good kind of period to stop and test and confirm before you move forward with actually installing the McWill screen. So let me go ahead and turn this thing on, and I picked Sonic because it makes sound right away. So even though I can't see anything, I am going to hear stuff, and when I press buttons, you know, stuff should happen. So let me just go ahead. Okay, awesome. So that means it's working. Let me just test some buttons. Yep. All right. Well, that looks good. So this system is still working correctly. So let's go ahead and move forward and start installing that mod. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do for installing the McWill kit is we have a whole bunch of wires to solder on the board itself. And so I'm going to start by soldering wires to these two backlight pads right here. These are going to go to the contrast wheel, and this will allow us to actually change brightness by modifying the contrast wheel. So just go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to do these here because it's a real pain in the butt to access this later on when the McWill is attached to the Game Gear. So I'm going to start by just putting these here now because it's easy. Okay, so that's all set. Okay, so now we're going to take the McWill and we're going to just slide it directly in over here. So I really like this particular part of the design that it just kind of slots right in and you just kind of line it up. It doesn't have to be perfect yet. We're going to deal with the alignment later when it's time to actually put it into the shell. But, you know, for now, getting it close enough is going to be fine. You can see why now I soldered those two wires in advance, because you can see it's right under the cartridge slot. It's really tough to get in there. It's rather annoying. So best to do that step first. Okay, so now that that's done, what we're going to do is we're going to solder these three pads here. These correspond to the three buttons, which is number 1, number 2, and start. So we're going to solder to 3 different points on the motherboard here. For that, that allows us to go into changing the screen settings. If you just hold all 3 buttons down, you can change the screen settings. I'll demonstrate that later when the mod is finished. We also need power and ground, and we're going to get that right over here. This 33 microfarad capacitor here, this is the main filter cap for the board. So we can get our 5 volts here, and we can get our ground over here on this side down here. Over here on this side, we have a few things to connect to as well. So we need to connect up to the clock signal, and we also need to connect up to a pad on the front of the Game Gear, and that is for Master System mode, because there's a few games that run in this Master System mode, and so we need to be able to connect up to that as well. All right, so let's get started with those various connections. Okay, so this whole left-hand side is finished, and so just kind of briefly go over what I did. So the backlight wires, I have them very carefully routed so that they're out of the way of the cartridge slot, and the one on the left-hand side goes to the top here on pin 1. The one on the right-hand side goes here to pin 2. These 3 pads, they connect to the number 1, number 2, and start buttons on the front of the PCB. And so you can tap into that by going to capacitors 28, 29, and 30, respectively. And then power and ground are handled right over here. This is that filter cap I was talking about earlier. So we've got our ground over here on the bottom side, and on the top side, we've got our plus 5 volts. So all of that is all taken care of. So now we only have 3 more wires on this side to take care of. So we've got to do a single wire going from test point 10 to test point 11 right over here. So it doesn't have anything actually to do with the McWill itself. We've got a pad over here for clock, and so that's going to connect, I believe, over here on the board. We've got one here to toggle between Game Gear mode and SMS mode, and that's going to go on the front of the console. And then finally, there's a test pad T2 over here, and that's going to connect up to the C-Sync pad, which is somewhere up here. I can't remember exactly where. So it's not too much. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that now. And then after that, we're almost done. All right, so now we're down to the last little bit of soldering, and it's a little bit tricky because you need to take 6 wires and solder them to the pads where the LCD screen used to be. So it is tricky just because these pads are very close together. You need to use a decent amount of flux to keep these pads from bridging, and just to make sure you have a nice stable connection. So I did all of these off camera just because you kind of have to count and figure out, which pin, because this is like pin 9 and 18 and 20. And it's just tedious, and so I figured it'd just be easier to just do that off camera. But I did leave one behind deliberately so I could show you just how to get the last one in place, which is going to go right here. This is pin 16. So what I'm going to do is get some flux and give it a pretty generous amount of flux right there. And you can see I have all of these wires. They're all orienting in the same kind of direction, like and that's because it's going to connect up to the McWill on the opposite side. So you just get it carefully lined up, hold your hands steady, and then we're going to just tack it into place. Just like that. So it's actually pretty quick, but as long as you have enough flux and solder here, you can make a good stable connection and you don't have to worry about these coming off. But yeah, the tricky part is just keeping these all separated from each other and no bridges between pads. If they do bridge, it's fine. You can just use some flux and maybe some solder braid and clean it up. Okay, so now that those are all in place, what we're going to do is we're going to connect these wires up to various pads here on the McWill motherboard right here. So the furthest, the lowest number, which is number 9, is going to go here, and it kind of just goes like this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, going from the lowest number to the highest number over here. All right, so let me go ahead, solder those into place, and then this is just about done. All right, so I've actually gone ahead and done a quick test, and I made sure that it worked, and it does. And I'll show you guys the final results in a few minutes, but what I wanted to do here was just tell you that after you do your quick initial test and everything is working, you actually have to come back and just make sure that everything is aligned. So you kind of have to go back and forth and look at the screen, make sure everything's centered, adjust it, and then come back. And I did this like 2 or 3 times until I was perfectly happy with where it is. Now that it's actually adjusted exactly where I want it to be, I'm going to solder the screen into place to prevent it from moving ever again. So what I'm going to do specifically is I'm going to put some solder onto these pads and some solder here onto the board and build it up and get it put back together. You don't have to do it on all 4 corners. In fact, it's rather tough because there's some wires all over the place nearby there. So normally I just settle for 2 of them, and that's usually enough to keep everything pretty locked in. All right, so I've got everything reassembled, and yeah, take a look at this, and it's pretty damn beautiful. Yeah, so everything's working just fine, and the screen looks outstanding. I'm going to just show you really quickly that with the contrast wheel, if I dial it in, I had it actually very low, and you can really make it pretty darn bright by making adjustments to that. Now, I'm going to try to adjust the different modes. So to do that, I'm going to hold down the 1 and 2 buttons and start all together. And yep, So there's our vertical scan lines, which I'm not sure if this is capturing well on my camera, but it looks really good and pretty authentic compared to the original screen, which also has vertical scan lines. And then you have a stretch mode like this, stretch with scan lines. And I believe this is the original aspect ratio on the screen. And then this is the default mode, which is personally the way I play mine. So yeah, honestly, this is a huge upgrade from the original screen. It needs far less power than the original screen as well, so it means that on 6 batteries, you'll get a much longer playtime. I haven't tried this recently in a while with like fresh batteries to see how long it'll go, but I'm fairly confident there are people out there who have done those kinds of comparisons, but it's definitely much longer. Alright guys, well that's it for this video. If you guys like this kind of content, then think about subscribing to the channel. I have videos out like this every Friday, and now my website is back up and running. I had it closed because I was traveling for most of the month of April, but now I'm back, and so if you guys have any consoles that need to be repaired or modified, you can always contact me directly at oneuprestorations.com. Alright guys, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.